So that's why I believe identity is a critical issue that we have to pay attention to and protect in the 21st century. Now, by the way, I'm not simply talking in abstract generality. Every single day when you open the newspaper or turn on television, you see examples of what happens when we can't validate identity, how individuals are injured because they lose control of their identity. Obviously, for example, if a terrorist comes into the country using a false identity, that threatens very real physical harm to people in this country. If somebody has their bank account invaded or has their financial situation impaired because they've been the subject of an impersonation, that hurts that person in a very real way in their pocketbook. Recently, a couple weeks ago in California, I announced a Secret Service Department of Justice investigation into the largest identity theft in American history, largest identity theft prosecution ever brought, involving 40 million credit card and debit numbers that had been hacked through cyberspace by a network of cyber thieves with potentially millions of dollars in exposure and losses to the people whose card numbers were used and then exploited to withdraw cash or engage in business transactions. And even in the area of the workforce, there are very real victims to identity theft and to the loss of control over your identity. Sometimes there's controversy attached to the fact that we prosecute people who are illegally in the country for using other people's identities, misusing other people's identities, and falsely using those identities to get work. Now, some say, well, that's a victimless crime. These are merely people who, they may be violating the law by working illegally, but they're really not doing anybody any harm by stealing an identity. But a few weeks ago, the Wall Street Journal ran a compelling story about a California woman who was not only repeatedly asked to pay taxes on North Carolina income from being paid by a company that she had never worked for and knew nothing about, but who was also forced to spend literally days on the phone trying to deal with credit dunning letters and calls from credit card companies and other harassment because someone who was working illegally had stolen their identity, was not paying taxes, and was otherwise damaging her credit rating. So there are very real consequences to the failure to control identity. And that is why, to me, privacy is served by some of the steps we're taking to protect identity. And I'm going to describe a little bit about what it is I think we ought to be doing over the next decade to really take it to the next level in terms of identity protection. But before I do, let me challenge and address three objections that are often raised when I talk about identity security. You know, secure driver's licenses, secure documents, things of that sort. And the three are often portrayed as privacy-based objections. And I've already indicated to you, I think, in a way, protecting your identity protects your privacy. But let me deal with each of these arguments head on. One argument that's not often made, but in many ways I think is probably the most serious argument, is the argument from anonymity. People who say, you know, in our society we should simply not be required to identify ourselves. We shouldn't have to account for who we are to engage in daily life. There's a lot of truth to that argument. I would certainly say that absent extraordinary circumstances, if you walk down the streets of Cleveland, you shouldn't have to show your identity to somebody or establish who you are to window shop or to cross the road or to walk around and look at the lakefront. On the other hand, I think most people would agree that if someone wants to cross a border and come into the United States, they should be required to identify themselves. If they want to go into a nuclear power plant, they should be required to identify themselves. I also would argue, and I think many, although not all would agree with me, that in this day and age, if you want to get on an airplane, a commercial airplane, you should have to identify yourself. And that's because we know, and we learn from painful experience, that if people who are dangerous get on airplanes, that increases the risk to the other people on the plane. And therefore, those other people have a right to know who is on the airplane with them. Sometimes I think I'd like to run a market test in which I arranged with an airline to set up what we would call anonymous airline. An anonymous airline would dispense with all of the security measures involving the watch lists and all of those things which are sometimes a nuisance. And they would simply say, you know what, anybody gets on the plane, we don't need to know who you are, just present a ticket like a bus ticket. and we'd see how many people fly the airline. My hunch is you wouldn't get a lot of takers. In fact, my hunch is you wouldn't get a lot of pilots. And that's, I think, indicative of the fact that most people understand that the people who are traveling with each individual passenger have a right to know identity. In fact, in some ways, my kind of touchstone answer to the question of anonymity is what I call the caller ID model of privacy. Under caller ID, I have a right to go to my phone company and say, I don't want to have my number displayed on caller ID. But if I call you and you see on your display caller refuses to give number, you have a right to say, I'm not picking the phone up. I don't want to deal with a person who is anonymous. And in many ways, I think that's a perfect metaphor for how you deal with the issue of anonymity. When a person's activities don't disturb or impinge on others, they should be anonymous. But when they're doing things that do potentially pose a threat to others or have an impact on others, then other people have a right to insist they know who they're dealing with. A second argument that's made sometimes is, frankly makes no sense to me, is, okay, you have a right to have people identify themselves, but you shouldn't insist that the form of identification be secure. You should let them present anything to identify themselves. That's what I call the right to false identification. There is no such right. There is no value in saying that a person should be required to identify themselves, but we're going to make it easy to lie about who you are. And there's even less value for me, for example, to a system where I'm, for example, easily enabled to take Ralph's identity and invade his bank account. And for those who question whether it's easy, for example, to get a fake driver's license, I suggest you go to a college town and see how many people are drinking, under the age of 21 using phony driver's licenses. So that's an argument that I frankly don't think has much merit. The last argument, and the one which I think is what we need to address to deal with this issue in the next 10 years, is the concern people have about, yes, we agree you should have to identify yourself. Yes, we agree that it's important to have secure forms of identification, but we just don't feel that what we currently have, the kinds of forms we have, really do a very good job of protecting identity, and they actually are subject to other vulnerabilities. And that's a serious issue. One issue, for example, that we have tried to address is the ease with which even fairly sophisticated documents can be counterfeited and forged and therefore imitated. And we address that by putting into effect more security requirements, barcodes, various kinds of things that can be inserted into the document. But if we look more broadly, I would say that the key to dealing with the problem of getting truly secure documents and really protecting the security of those documents has to do with what I call the 3 Ds of identification: description, device, and digit. And it's my contention that these are the 3 keys to a secure identification system. What do I mean? Description is currently actually one of the most common ways of identifying people. It happens, by the way, standing alone to be the most vulnerable. And that's simply the principle where you identify yourself by telling the person you're dealing with about some secret piece of information, like your social security number or your mother's maiden name. And the idea is that only the real person knows that piece of information, and therefore there's security in that identification process. The difficulty with that is every time you tell someone that secure piece of identification to validate yourself, that person has to know the secret, and therefore there's an additional vulnerability. That's why every few weeks you read about a laptop computer that was stolen and everybody's social security number is on it, and then everybody gets all spun up about whether there's going to be an invasion of privacy and people are going to steal your assets because they have their social security number. No one ever asks this question. Instead of asking why did the guy let the computer be stolen, why do we rely on social security numbers as the sole basis for identifying ourselves? It's got to be, if you think about it, silly to say that simply by giving your social security number, something which is in the hands of lots of people who are going to use it to validate you, simply say that's enough to validate you. So my argument is the real solution to the data theft problem is not to continue to make it harder and harder to work with information. It is to move away from a system where secret information by itself gives you an ability to access something where your identity is important.